This podcast and every other podcast that I make is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. Not only are they the reason that this kind of niche show exists at all, they also get some cool benefits, including completely ad-free episodes, early episodes, unedited episodes, and the ability to submit questions. Plus, depending on the tier, a special shout out at the end and the ability to play games with me. So if any of these things interest you or you just like to support this particular show, head to patreon.com/Charalanzard. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Video Game Writing 101. Today I'm joined by Danny and the sun. Sorry that it's so blown out. Danny, who are you exactly and what are you doing here?
I am the lead writer of Jedi Survivor, and I'm here to talk game writing with you.
I'm super excited. What are your credits outside of Jedi Survivor? Like, how do you just suddenly become the lead writer of a Star Wars EA AAA video game?
Just poof, they just found me off the street. I started about 12 years ago in game writing, did a bunch of indie games, did a fellowship at the University of Texas working with Warren Spector, and
Cool.
from there worked at Gearbox on an unannounced IP, and then a bunch of Borderlands stuff, and Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and then jumped ship and wanted to try my hand at Star Wars, which has been amazing.
Congratulations. I imagine it's pretty different working on Star Wars to working on, even though Borderlands is an established IP, Star Wars is an established IP. What are some of the unique challenges that come with working on Star Wars?
I think one of the things just as a writer is like the weight of expectation. We've got a lot of really incredible Star Wars stories out there, and we have a fan base that is always hungry for new stories. And so when we were working on Survivor, it's always in the back of my mind was like, how do our characters stand up? Like, how engaging are we? What are we doing in the galaxy that feels kind of new and different?
How do you balance that? Is that like a team perspective, or does some of that come through playtesting?
I think part of it is, the Respawn team was really smart to kind of find their corner of the galaxy they could play in. And as a result, Fallen Order and Survivor to me feel like very intimate stories in the Star Wars universe. We're not really going after huge galactic sweeps of, the soap opera is there to some extent, but it's really a story about Cal and his kind of earned a family and how they kind of survive.
Definitely agree. I feel like sometimes the scope of Star Wars can be like everybody in this galaxy, everybody. And I feel like this Jedi franchise that you're working on is a little more contained. But I would love to talk about Cal, because I played both games, and I feel like Cal initially was kind of cookie cutter hero who serves the story, and everyone else is a little more interesting than him. Whereas in Survivor, he's got some more edge to him. So there's obviously a pretty significant gap between these two games. How did you approach Cal's journey and the kind of evolution that he goes on as a character without losing his identity?
I think it starts with the beginning, right? So when you start the game on Coruscant, Cal's been fighting the Empire for 5 years, and he's largely been failing. He's been doing the best he can, but he's fighting a losing battle. And in the opening mission, he kind of realizes that. And so this game is less about how Cal kind of honors his Jedi past and fights against the Empire who took so much from him, and more about how he's going to kind of survive this time period that's so dark in the galaxy, right? There's very little hope, and Star Wars is such a franchise about hope. And in this moment, there's almost none of it. And so, a lot of, I think, the challenges he faces is how you derive hope in a galaxy that has little to none at the time. Who do you put your faith in? Who do you choose to ally with? Who do you choose to fall in love with?
Is that a thing that you're actively conscious of when trying to write Cal? Like, how much hope does he have, if that's such an important thing to Star Wars as a franchise?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things I like a lot about Cal is he's got a very interesting kind of, not morbid sense of humor, but kind of a darker sense of humor. He's been through so much since his childhood, right? Since the Clone Wars and Order 66. And so whenever he shows a bit of optimism, it's always kind of interesting and rare to me. And I think that's why BD is such a good counterbalance, because BD is his companion droid, and he's just BD is the character that helps Cal retain hope in his darkest moments. And so like the two of them and their friendship, I think is really fun to play with.
I guess BD1 is also like the co-protagonist. He's there all the time.
Oh yeah,
He's just as much of
absolutely.
a character. So how do you, it's a great follow-up, is how do you write BD1? Is there a style guide? Do you have a character sheet? Do you have like when you're writing dialogue, is it boop? Like how do you actually write the droid?
It's definitely Boop. I mean, BD is kind of like Cal's little companion slash like best friend dog. And when we're writing scripts, the line is always Boop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like a rule of the writing team is we don't try to, the sound designers will come later and they will interpret the kind of like parenthetical personality or intent. So we might say like, I'm afraid in parentheticals, it's still Boop. And then the sound designers will come back in. And I think, BD's kind of sticking with these kind of pure emotions, whether it's fear or hope or curiosity, help us write Cal because Cal can kind of interpret that and then kind of expand on it.
I also love how comforting he is, because sometimes I feel like that works well with the player too. Like you're up against something that looks enormous and you're like, oh my God, am I going to be able to do this? And then he comforts BD1 and I'm like, that worked for me too. I have also been comforted. He's so cute too. Like, did that come organically? I know Manny also worked on the creation of BD1 because I spoke to him before, of like how adorable he is. Like there's Lego of him now, like this just little droid that everybody's just fallen in love with.
I wasn't on the first game, so I don't know how they did it, but I do think BD is like one of the most cherished and wonderful parts of like Respawn's contribution to the galaxy. Yeah. There's just something so, his curiosity is so infectious and incredible that like even during like the hard times on the project, as anyone on a project would have, because video games are amazingly difficult to make, like BD is one of those like sources of hope for all of us.
That's very cute. So directly from that question, you did not work on the first game, but you worked on Jedi Survivor. What is it like coming in on a sequel?
For me, it was just an incredible opportunity. As I was finishing some of my work at Gearbox, I had this kind of like short list of like dream like projects to work on, and I played Fallen Order right when it came out, and I think just like a lot of fans, the characters just really resonated for me in a way that I hadn't expected. I remember playing Fallen Order with my wife, and when Marin like entered the picture, she just swooned. Like she was like, I've never seen a female character like this in a game, and I've watched you play a lot of games. And so as we were kind of talking about my career and next steps, we were like, wow, we got to try to get on this sequel. It's going to be incredible. Yeah.
How did you actually action that? Was that just telling people at Respawn that you really wanted to do it?
I reached out to the narrative director and said, I'm a big fan and I'd love to work on the game.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like that there's a lot of truth in, especially for writing. I've done that a million times. You can't always expect opportunities to come to you. You kind of have to create them. If you want to do something, you kind of have to make it happen.
Yeah, I think it's really true. I mean, when I talk to a lot of like young aspiring game writers and narrative designers, I tell them the same thing, which is like, you can't wait for an opportunity. Most jobs aren't posted. Like you got to have all your scripts ready. And, so it's like every few years I'll write a spec script on a few games I've played and enjoyed just because you never know what happens. And I didn't do that for Fallen Order, but when I wrote my first script, I'd been thinking about it a lot. Like I'd been thinking about what I would want to do with Cal and Marin and kind of if I got the chance. And so when I actually joined the team, it was a pretty natural thing for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, like a dream come true.
Really amazing.
Yeah. So going a little bit off course there, we spoke about this slightly before we started recording, but I feel like it's a common criticism at the moment of some games writing, which I understand why it exists, that characters could be too chatty. Your protagonists can be too chatty, especially when they have an ensemble. This is something that seemingly like doesn't come up that much in playtesting, but then it seems like the internet gets really upset, which is half the reason why it's there. Is playtesters like, I got confused. I do not feel like that happens in Jedi Survivor, and as we were talking about just before, there's a lot of silence at the start of the game, where almost everybody else, I think, would go for having, especially because it's Star Wars, it's so easy, having Cal quip or make jokes or, be self-deprecating. Sure. Was that intentional restraint, and how do you balance how often you want him to say something versus actually sitting in silence and letting players kind of commentate themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think our inner desire as writers is to kind of explain potentially and really like paint the world with dialogue as often as we can. But like in an opening level like Coruscant, where there's so much happening, where there's these really high stakes, while we're trying to do a lot very quickly, setting the scene, kind of getting players up to speed. I always think about how often dialogue's playing and how long I want a particular line of dialogue to resonate. So for example, like there's an exchange in the Coruscant where the ISB officer who's bowed says, level 2046 seen better days, and Bravo replies, war's expensive, someone's got to pay for it. And like to me, like that exchange is kind of like that sets what's happened in the last decade for people in the Undercity. And if you have dialogue that follows right after that or too much, like that those lines won't resonate and the player won't really think about them. And sometimes dialogue stacks and gains meaning as you add more and more, but other times restraint and taking lines away and creating that kind of that space for something to resonate, for the player to really chew over it, I think is really effective.
So was that how that scene looked at the start, or was it edited back?
Oh no, it's absolutely not. I mean, it's a lot of iteration and revision. I think like anyone's first pass or first 10 passes on the script are chock full of dialogue as you're trying to really figure out what you want to say, and then slowly over time you refine it, and then you get the professional recording in, and then before pickups you really go, okay, wow, like these lines are hitting on their own. You get a bit of confidence, and from that you can take away until just like the best stuff's left.
Yeah, and I know this is different for every studio, but as you work with other teams, like you work with art, you work with level design, or whoever else, does that have a huge impact on the dialogue that stays? Like maybe you'll have a line added in or removed based on something level design did, for example. Is that like a part of the process for you?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, like to take Coruscant, either narrative designer or an artist recommended that a probe droid appears near the very beginning of the level, and that wasn't originally part of it. The probe droid moment later is when it comes down by the bridge and kind of scans what you will soon find out is like the briefcase that contains Cal's lightsaber, and that was the droid moment. But someone recommended putting that in earlier because it's creepy, because now you get this kind of impression that the Empire and the Senator is kind of watching your every move. And like once you have that visual representation, you can kind of peel some of the dialogue back and take some stuff out that was trying to convey that emotion, because the visual, I think, is stronger in that case.
It's also, like you said, I definitely agree that it's hard not to overwrite things or want to put dialogue for color and everything. But I think it's also kind of nice when players can feel like they've figured something out on their own rather than having a character just tell them. Like if you can convey the plot, which I think you guys did. I don't want to, I could spoil the first level. Coruscant in general is like sort of a mini heist that has some twists and turns in it, which happens so fast. Then I didn't feel like the characters were taking me along for a ride. I felt like I was part of it. And I think some of that does come from not explaining to me or over-explaining the stakes or who everyone is at every single step of the way. And I also think this is a spoiler. The choice to have people die so fast was a very interesting one to me.
Are we not talking spoilers?
I mean, I think we are,
been a month
because
I've
just done it. We're okay. Yeah, go ahead.
on our side, I think we're good to chat.
Yeah. Spoilers. I can put a spoiler warning at the start, actually, just so people know.
Let's do it. I mean, I think with the first part of the question, that's a really tricky opening to write. You're introducing 5 new characters to the player. The stakes aren't what they seem. Like we're kind of both putting the player in the player as Cal is kind of having to catch up with Cal, because it's the heist is a ruse, right? And that's really challenging to pull off. And again, I think that's why we felt less was more in this case, because we didn't want to tip our hand. We wanted players to kind of intuit from how this crew was talking. Well, maybe
I didn't realize it at first because I was so blown away by looking at the environments. And then the second time I played through the opening, I was like, oh, they do mention it. Like I had just
Yeah,
totally
it's very
skipped out on it.
guarded. It's very guarded, and also we're trying to do triple duty there because we want you to care about these characters,
Mm.
but they're helmeted, which makes it very tough because
Yeah.
you're really just hearing their processed voices. But we have so little time with this crew that we want everything to kind of have meaning. And so Gab's is definitely one of my favorite characters of the heist crew. It's like you learn really early on that she's kind of the schemer and she's a little bit in it for the credits, but you have to do it on such like a tight rope.
Yeah.
So really, really challenging.
Why did you decide to kill them all? Why could they not have lived?
I think they kind of stand as Cal's surrogate family now that the Mantis crew has kind of went their separate ways after the events of Fallen Order. And he Cal's so much of Cal's story is finding family and holding on to family because he never has really had it, it was sad for me too. I loved those characters. I thought the Coruscant crew was really cool. I would love to do a whole thing with just them, but unfortunately, these are dark times, and
I guess it does very quickly set up that it's a dark time and not everything is sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a narrative designer. You just said that phrase, and I always want to ask. It means a different thing at every studio. At Respawn, what is a narrative designer? What do they do?
Narrative designers are mission designers that work really closely with the writers and level designers and the rest of our kind of small level teams. And they do all of the scripting for our companion characters like Bowden Marin. They do all the VO implementation. They really have an eye towards and help us as writers understand the opportunities in any given level, how something will be implemented, if there's something that a writer isn't thinking about in terms of the difficulty of implementing dialogue or anything else that has to do with kind of story delivery.
So your narrative designers are the ones putting the dialogue in engine.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that's different depending on the studio as well. Some of them seem to be like very systems based. Like at some studios, they're the people who make sure that dialogue doesn't overlap. They work more closely with level design than writers sometimes. So it's just such an interesting term that I think is like more studios have them now, but it still tends to mean a different thing. Some studios don't have writers; they just have narrative designers.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I know. I think Obsidian is like that.
Yeah,
I'm thankful for the having the two different kind of roles because I think when you cross into more of the design mindset, you have a certain lens of how you tell the story, which is very different from, I think, if you're approaching things mostly from kind of a writing entertainment point of view. And it's a nice kind of bit of friction when, a writer goes to a narrative designer and says like, I've got this idea. And the narrative designer is like, well, how are we going to pull it off? And I think that kind of that dialogue creates really interesting moments.
it's probably also pretty important for scope. Like I think if you're just going straight from writing something, you can unintentionally, like this has happened to me, where I pitch something and not knowing how expensive it is, and having narrative designers be like, we probably can't do that. Very quickly be like, that might be slightly too expensive. You can't just
in game. I want you to hand an object to another NPC who's going to pick the object up, and then
definitely not happening. Yeah, sorry, just that's a very technical question, but an interesting one to ask. So, outside of that, what is your actual process for writing on a game like this at Respawn? Do the writers start first? Like literally how did you start the narrative for this game? What's the process?
Well, I joined a little bit after pre-production had started, so I can't speak to the origins completely, but I mean, story is obviously a really integral part of the Jedi franchise. And so we work with creative director Stig, our narrative director, and then LucasArts as we're kind of breaking story and characters. And then simultaneously, we're also kind of laying the foundation for like the general narrative flow of the game, which helps inform level design and kind of our art sets and everything. So, but I think, my experience at Respawn is it's been a very organic kind of process of like teams kind of working, kind of coinciding and working together as we refine the story.
What's it like to work with LucasArts? I don't know how much you could say, but that is not a thing that a lot of studios do in terms of like working on a franchise that somebody else owns. like Star Wars. So what is that relationship like?
I mean, I've had a great time with the LucasArts. I think it's been really fascinating seeing the franchise and kind of how LucasArts talks about the franchise. And, we have sync meetings, and they're just kind of really wonderful exchanges of ideas. And I think, for me, coming from a place of being a Star Wars fan, but I hadn't like read all the novels and comic books, there's just a really incredible amount of like things I didn't know about Star Wars that I learned over the course of the project, which was really helpful.
That's cool. Like in terms of actually writing for Star Wars, what are you starting with? You just read a bunch of stuff? Do people research for you? Like how do you actually dive into the universe for being the lead writer on a game?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty out there, and it's all really fascinating.
So much.
When I first started, yeah, when I first started on the team, I read some novels and some comic books and watched all the TV shows and movies. And I think also just playing Fallen Order was really instructive to me because I think it was a really well-researched game that really, again, chose some sections of the IP that I wasn't as familiar with, like the Inquisitors as an example. And so for Survivor, there was such a really good foundation from Fallen Order on kind of what the identity of the games were about. And so for me, it was a relatively seamless thing. I'm sure there was a lot of heavy lifting and hard work and research and stuff that came before that. But by the time I joined the project, I felt like I had a really good understanding of kind of what new spaces the game was going to take place in, and kind of the information I needed to figure out the right decisions for characters.
That's great. Love that. In terms of new characters and the existing characters that obviously repeat in Survivor, I was talking about this while playing through it. Super curious how you approached the amount of new players who might play Survivor who didn't play Fallen Order, and the clear importance of these characters to Cal, because obviously I can't remove my own memory of playing Fallen Order. So I was like, I wonder if new players, how they take the introduction or the reintroduction of some of these characters and how important they are. Is it confusing? How do you balance that? Like things that are clearly important in the first game for anyone playing the sequel, but the fact that you might have people playing Survivor who didn't touch Fallen Order.
Yeah, it's really tough. It's always tough to understand kind of and even for people who played Fallen Order, the game came out, many, many years ago. Yeah. And I will say, just a shout out to like that opening kind of like story recap, I thought was absolutely beautiful. When I first saw that, I was like, oh, well, this is doing a lot of the work for us. Like, I think you get a lot of kind of just the tone and the understanding of kind of Cal's basic relationship to Cal and Marion Grease from that. So that was very helpful. I think, beyond that, there's I think one of the challenges for game writers is always understanding what to include and what not to include, or where to include certain information and where to put other information, right? And I think one of the values and the joys of game writing is you have cinematics and you have grid path levels, and then you have all of these other wonderful avenues where you can kind of tell more about characters. So if you might not have remembered so much of the relationship between Seer and Cal, as an example, you can talk in Seer's base and kind of find more about that relationship. So there are avenues for players who are interested to kind of peek back into the relationships from Jedi Fallen Order.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the opening recap was incredible, and I imagine pretty hard to make. I feel like whoever made that did a great job. That stuff is way harder than it seems a lot of the time. But in terms of adding in new characters, I've forgotten the character's name. The frog that everyone's losing their minds about.
Turgle.
Yes. Did you expect that? Because I also loved him immediately. I love that voice actor. And he's like maybe an hour and a half in, and he's just so lovable. Did you expect the internet to blow up about Turgle?
Lovable is an interesting word to use. I don't know if I think it could have gone either way. And for some people, maybe it did. Characters like Turgle are so fun to write because they're just instigators, and like every story needs instigators. And literally, he's the instigator of this story because he's been trying to find something for Ravis, one of the villains he face. And, I read a lot of Turgle, a lot of the Cantina stuff as well. And I think maybe part of that was just from my experience writing for the Borderlands franchise, which contains an innumerable amount of zany characters. But But I think some of the things kind of I learned from working in Borderlands was even a character like Turgle, who's basically a cartoon character, has to have something underpinning them, or they kind of seem flat and hollow. And so there's for people who wish to talk to Turgle more than once, as you kind of delve deeper into our Insane Frog's character, there's some fun kind of twists and turns in his emotional state and kind of
I loved him.
his crushing loneliness.
Yeah.
It also helps that the voice actor is like absolutely incredible and has that kind of nuance of comedic timing. I mean, it's really we were helped a lot. We had a great cast all told. But Richard, who played Turgle, was just knocked out of the park.
But did you expect people to freak out about Turgle the way they have?
I knew they would freak out, but again, how would they freak out?
Yeah.
Absolute hate, absolute love.
Yeah.
I think that's comedic characters are just tough. You just never know. You never know if a character is going to hit or feel grating to players.
Yeah.
I'm delighted. I think he's really weird. And I think that's, it's like, there's a lot of sci-fi franchises out there. There's not a lot of worlds that are like Star Wars where you can have like ultra serious, dramatic characters and then like a scheming frog who's always trying to like bilk people at a cantina. And I like the breadth of tone there. It's really fun to work in.
Yeah, and it's also, do you find it to be restricting? Like, I feel like in my head, Jedi Survivor, and I would say like Rogue One and Andor of all the modern Star Wars for me, and Fallen Order, feel the most Star Wars. Like I could elaborate on that, but I won't. It'll take too long. But they feel very Star Wars. I think Jedi Survivor's done such a good job of like having me actually feel like I'm walking through any of the pre-existing movies. Is that tone restrictive for you to play around in, or do you feel like it's very freeing?
I think it's very freeing. I mean, I think Star Wars is such growing up and like watching the original trilogy, like it's such a dark story to like to go through, because I think for me Star Wars is like it's about hope and how hope survives over generations, which is like, if there's like one thing I think entertainment like does that's really positive, it's like to remind us of things that came before trials and tribulations, and to give us some small semblance that things can get better and that the fight can go on. And that's really like a heavy kind of theme, right? Yeah. And so like I feel like it'd be really hard to pull it off across one story, let alone hundreds, if you didn't have the Turgles of the world, if you didn't have these strange, weird bits of the galaxy that that kind of give you not only some comic relief, but also just the stakes kind of to me at least become greater when you have like weird comedic characters alongside like characters who are fighting for their very lives.
I guess you something to fight for too. Like if you have characters who are positive, you feel like you have to fight for their positivity to stay, so not everything's all gloomy. And I was just happy to see him. I'd totally fight for Turgle. Yeah, I loved him. Do you have a favorite character in the in Jedi Survivor, I guess, to narrow it down?
Oh, I can't choose. I think one of the characters I think really resonated for me and was a lot of fun to write that I hadn't seen quite as often in Star Wars is the character Moran, who's kind of a washed up trader who finds his way to the cantina, and he's cynical and surly and contains absolutely no hope whatsoever, and looks at the rest of the fellow patrons of the cantina with like almost just like universal disgust. And I think that character and the course of his story was just kind of something a little different that I hadn't seen so often. So it was really fun to kind of unpack this character who's felt like his life was basically over and that he had missed every opportunity in his life, and there was nothing around the corner to look forward to. And if you play his story and you talk with him all the way through the end, there's kind of some fun reveals that I think felt kind of gratifying for me.
Do you know how many characters you actually have? I feel like it's a lot.
I can answer that question by the number of gray hairs in my wave. I know this is a podcast, which is to say a lot of characters.
It does seem like a pretty significant amount. Do you know how much dialogue you recorded? I can't imagine you know the lines off by heart either.
It's tons. I mean, even when you just think about like the Cantina
Yeah,
patrons.
that's what I was
That's
thinking about.
hundreds and hundreds of pages across. We have what we call macro states, which are like the 5 general kind of um, big story beats that the cantina and kind of its patrons turn through, and then we have sub states, which are like, now we really get into the weeds here. So is which are like the smaller tonal shifts from plot point to plot point, and across macro states and sub states, it's like 25 or 30, which means every time you stream back in there, you can talk to a character and get more dialogue. And that's irrespective of then other ways that we add dialogue based on different player progression. So it's a ton of work.
And a lot of that's
but again,
optional
it's
too,
like,
right? Like the people don't actually have
a
to
lot of
engage.
it's off.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So much of it's optional. But again, that's, our goal is to create a Star Wars cantina. Like, it's got to be populated with a wide variety of strange, lovable, hateable characters who have something to say, not only about Cal's story, but about just what's happening on Kobo and whatnot. And it's part of the job. Is you read a lot of stuff that you don't know if players will ever engage with. But I think from what I've seen on the reaction online, it's like when you hit a line of dialogue and someone, like, it resonated for someone and it was like buried 4 conversations deep into a substate, and they like write you and they're like, oh, I really love this. Like, it does kind of feel worth it, even though it was a lot of work.
Was that a thing you had to fight for at all? Like making sure that the cantina was heavily populated with so many lines of dialogue where, I feel like making AAA games is just a bunch of give and take for several years between different facets. Like, was that something that everyone was unified on from the start?
Yeah, I think the team wanted to nail Star Wars Cantina. I mean, I think that was just a fantasy that, like, a lot of resources were put into that because it's such a powerful fantasy in the Star Wars universe. Yeah. And for our part on the narrative side, we couldn't sparsely populate that with a few characters and call it a day. Like, I think we wanted the player to feel both the emptiness of the cantina when you first arrive on Kobo. It starts to fill up slowly, both based on like the main plot, but also recruiting different characters. And then it starts to empty again based on the Empire's growing presence. And I think having that cadence of the rise and fall of the cantina was definitely resource intensive, but I think really worth it. Like, for players who have played through the end game and then they've talked to everyone in the cantina, like, I think some of the best writing, honestly, in the game is like the last few characters who remain in the cantina after everyone else has left.
It's crazy because the percentage of players who've done that has to be so low. Like, what are the current stats of finishing? Like 10%, I think, is currently the finishing rate for most video games. And like the importance of all of that and how rarely people see it is like something I try not to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it is soul crushing if you think about it too much, but I think the other way
it also makes it special.
Well, it's special, and also like the community that you carry from one game to the other is like worth its weight in gold, and like that as a game writer, you can provide this meaning and this little extra bit of time for players to spend time with characters that they've grown attached to is really rewarding. Yeah. And then those players are the ones on Reddit talking about, I can't believe this character did this, and what have you. And I think like from game to game, that community is really valuable to foster.
How much time do you actually spend like watching people's reactions, watching Let's Plays or streams, or reading stuff on Reddit when the game came out? Because I feel like working on Star Wars is a lot of pressure. That's how I would feel.
Look, I was really excited when the critical and fan reaction was very positive.
I bet.
It was really rewarding. I mean, look, like, you spend years of your life on a project, like, you don't know how it's going to turn out. Games are difficult. The most difficult thing in a game is telling a story, in my opinion, because there's so many aspects of like of storytelling that like a game writer just doesn't really have access to, like pacing as an example, right? Yeah. And so when you actually finish a game on the dev side and it goes out and it's positive, like I'm ravenous. I love seeing people talk about the ending and debating over like character choices, and I love just the silly Let's Plays of people fooling around or talking to Turgle and getting told like, go away, cow. Like, I just think that stuff's lovely. I mean, why do we write if not to entertain people? And so I want to see that entertainment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't imagine not, to be fair. I can't imagine not engaging with it. That would be a little bit strange. But it is an interesting thing that I think I didn't understand before I started working in dev. And I don't know if this applies to everybody, but it definitely does to me. It sounds like it might for you. Is that while working on something, I lose concept of if it's good or not. I had that with Ragnarok. That I was like, I think it is. I'm pretty sure, but I don't know, because you see something in so many iterations, and you're looking at it as a technical thing of like, are all the parts where they're supposed to be, rather than as a game anymore. So when it came out and people liked it, I was like, oh, thank God. I don't know if that's the same for everyone, but I definitely felt
yeah,
that way.
right there with you.
Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
look, I mean, I've played through the game hundreds of times, like
Yeah.
across every version of it. When we had Robo Voice, and then we had I mean, and you just, I think it's really hard to get clarity on what you're building. That's why you do play testing, and I think that really helps to some extent. It's hard to play something for the 20th time and still like it, even if it's written perfectly. And I think one of the things that's really challenging for us as like a narrative team is not changing things for the sake of us as devs wanting to hear something new and different. And so I'll definitely spar from time to time with given lines where I'm like, I know we're tired of this line. It's a good line.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. People can be like, is that line bad? Because they've heard it 100 times.
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, I think a lot of, I don't know if this has been your experience, but my experience as game writer is also that like half of the job is like advocacy across like gaining resources for storytelling, but then also kind of defending your work and kind of knowing that a voice delivered, a line of dialogue delivered in robo voice will sound good when a professional actor gets a hold of it. I swear, I think it's something that you kind of like hopefully learn over time, and you have a good enough kind of radar to understand like what's going to kind of play as you get more resources and actors and stuff on it.
Yeah, so to talk about actors and robo voice, I guess, for anyone who doesn't know, robo voice is generally like you'll have robots read your lines before you hire an actual actor. We sometimes have people in the studio. Atreus was voiced by a female dev for a long time, which is always really fun because they're not actors.
Oh, yeah.
What is your casting process like? Like, you're casting for a character like Turgle. I mean, any of the huge band of characters that you have. Do you write with actors in mind? Obviously, you get to do that with Cameron. But otherwise, is it something that you send out a sheet for some of them, or some of them you cast in your head beforehand? Like, how much flexibility is that when you're actually writing these characters?
Yeah, we have our casting sheets, and they often have a section where we'll reference either actors or characters from popular media, kind of just to give the anyone reading kind of a general sense, like tonally, and kind of characterize what we're going for. And then from there, we it's a pretty wonderful process of hearing 20 to 50 takes on a character, and sometimes it just hits, like in the opening lines, and an actor is just kind of like gleaned what you were hoping for and just kind of nails it. Moran is an example. We knew as we started writing Moran, I'd worked with John Michael Tatum, who's the actor who plays Moran on the Borderlands franchise. He plays Sir Hammerlock. And as we started writing Moran, I knew John Michael Tatum just like was the person for it. I'd worked with him enough. I saw kind of how he can deliver nuance of a cynical kind of like tone. And so that was a character where we're like, if he's available, we're going to hire him. We definitely, but it differs based on auditions and whatnot. We cast a pretty wide net.
Do you ever have, sorry, I'm so sick. My voice is such a mess. Do you ever have somebody do something you completely didn't expect, and then you kind of rewrite parts of the character based on really liking an audition that was not at all what you had in your head?
Less so for auditions and more so for like when they finally select an actor, and once they've been cast and we've kind of had our first session with them. I mean, I think, if you're not learning a lot from about your characters from an actor, like you're not doing your job as a writer, because I think, so much of the value of whether you're in performance capture shoots or whether you're in the VO booth is listening to how someone with a different perspective takes your character and it kind of brings them to that performance. And so much of the fun, like the best part for me of being a game writer is absolutely working with the actors, because they just they see things differently. My dad's a professor, and he and my mom ran a independent theater when I was a kid, and so I spent a lot of time like a community theater just listening to the actors rehearse and whatnot. And I think you know a line can shift like just based on the inflection of like a single word. And it's kind of magical. And in game writing, where you have such confined spaces to some extent, like you're really looking for those moments where an actor can kind of say something just slightly different. And now it's not a cliche line, it's a line that has meaning. And I think that's something I always kind of advocate when we're working with actors, is to really listen to them, because they're really smart.
Yeah, I mean, it's their job to like take your character and know them more intimately than even you do. It's so cool. I know that this doesn't happen for every studio. Do you on the writing team all get to like join for the mocap days or be in the VO booth?
For the mocap performance capture stuff, it was Aaron Contreras who was the narrative director, and then me on set. There's a lot of people on that performance capture shoots,
huge.
and it's just a lot going on. And I mean, they're really fun, but you need like tight turnarounds on revisions. And Aaron and I would talk to the actors and the directors and kind of have to repitch moments and kind of explain the context, because they're recording a lot of the stuff like out of
order,
linear order
across years.
So across years, which is, you get good at kind of selling the story, helping like quickly orient an actor to kind of their motivation, which is really, really fun. And then you're taking their feedback on set, which is like, I think maybe outside looking in, some writers might balk at that, but like it's a really wonderful part of the process, because like it's very rigorous. And if an actor doesn't believe the lines they're about to deliver, like it won't turn out well. And so you either have to advocate for and like get them in the headspace of like why a scene should work a certain way, or you can kind of shift and rewrite the scene a bit too to kind of better fit how they view the character. And I think both are really valid. On the VO side, we have our writers often are parts of the VO sessions, depending on how busy they are. But it's really valuable, again, just to hear an actor kind of go through lines and how they kind of evolve, and how we often re-record the first 20 lines of a session just because the actor has now been warmed up and they've gotten into the character a bit more. And I think that's useful for writers to see too.
That's so cool, because not every studio does that for their writers. Was it the same at Gearbox?
Yeah, but Gearbox was like, when I first joined Gearbox, I was the VO director for my project.
Oh, there you go.
So it's like I was just working with our audio engineer and our actors. So I was pretty used to that. And so we would kind of, then another writer would join and basically be like script wrangler. And so we kind of did that. Gearbox has changed a lot since then, and they have a wonderful VO director, and it's a bit more kind of ordered like that. But that's kind of where I kind of like cut.
It's the whole part of your job.
That's where I started.
That makes sense.
Exactly.
So I'm going to ask you some super broad questions now. In terms of video game writing in general, not just about working on Jedi Survivor, what's your favorite part of the job?
I think the moments where design, art, and writing come together in a game are magical, and they're so difficult to pull off because every discipline is looking for something different. And so as I mentioned, like if I'm advocating for a moment in a game and then it comes through, you can feel it. And I think in most of the best games, or the games that resonate with me, everything's working in tandem. It's all these disparate elements kind of coming together in this kind of wonderful moment that I think it's hard to replicate across like linear media, because like you're part of the story. Like the story is kind of like allowing you to step into the role of a character, and they're hard to pull off because games are hard to make.
It's so many people. It's just so many
people.
Yeah, I guess I will say one thing that I've found uniquely very magical from my time at Santa Monica Studio is when multiple disciplines are unanimously excited about something. When everyone's like, this is really cool, we can't wait to do this. And then they bounce an idea back to you, and then you bounce an idea forward, and everyone's really excited. Like, I don't know that I've felt that way about anything in my life ever, when it's hundreds of people being like, this is awesome, let's do it. Like, that's so so cool and probably pretty unique to games because of the amount of just moving parts that are required to make a video game.
When you're playing a game that like really resonates for you, can you like sense those moments where you feel like on the other side the team kind of all came together?
I think I can now. I don't think I could before I
Okay.
started working in dev. Now I'll be like, oh, I bet you they're all stoked about that. Whereas beforehand, yeah, you don't. I mean, you don't think about it. You're just like, this is cool for me. You don't think about the bigger picture of all the people who worked on it. So yeah, I would say now I definitely can, and especially
Yeah.
certain things you're like, oh, they definitely had to fight for that. Like, oh, that would have been so expensive because I had so little concept of scope even working in games media before I started working in dev of like just how expensive and difficult some things are. Like Jedi Survivor has a bunch of quadrupeds. Like, that's hard. I know now that's really hard. Whereas before I'd be like, why doesn't the horse walk right? And now I'm like, it's so difficult to animate and so expensive to animate. Anything that
Oh
walks
yeah.
on four legs. Can everything float? Like, that's a lot cheaper. There's a lot of stuff like that.
We've got this pitch. It's a horse, but it's floating in air. What do you
Everything
think?
floats here. That's the best
Make
way
it
to
make
get
sense.
it in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
So to follow up that question, what is the most challenging thing about being a games writer, or your least favorite?
Wow. How long do we have? I mean, I think it's the converse to kind of the appreciation of those moments that come together, which is to say, there's people play games for such vastly different reasons. Like, I'm really fortunate, to be on a franchise where story is so important. But even that being said, like, there are times where players want to explore, and maybe the designers, want to give players, a sneak peek into what other things they could be doing. And I think trying to maintain a sense of tone and character with the understanding that like we have players who are going to just beeline through the story and experience that in kind of the way it would be naturally paced. And then we have other players who are going to go explore Kobo. And as a game writer, wrapping your head around and letting go of some of that control, I think it can be scary at first, because it comes with such a like narrative cost, which is to say, like, the longer a player is away from the main story, the less clarity they have over the characters and where they're at emotionally. And so you really have to be careful about, how you reintroduce a player to a character or a moment, understanding that they might have been gone for a while. And I think that's really challenging.
I guess letting players have agency, even if it means you feel like the story might take a hit, that's definitely a challenge. Yeah.
And so that's why, I think, holistically, kind of, we're telling a character-based story in Survivor, but we're also building a new world with Kobo, and we're also providing some really interesting information on the High Republic and kind of exploring that a little bit. And so I think, you kind of have to step back as a game writer and go, if our characters are strong enough, people will follow us to the end. And then otherwise, like, what other kinds of fun experiences can we give players that might have nothing to do with like our pure story or narrative goals?
To follow that up, what's one thing that you wish more people knew about video game writing that they maybe don't?
I think we've talked about it a bit, which is to say, it's so hard to tell a story in games that if you play a game and the characters resonate with you in any way, like, it's
Huge
basically
win.
a miracle.
Yeah.
I think it's it's useful for whether you're like watching a TV show or reading a novel. I think it's useful to step into the mind of the developers, the creators, and kind of understand how challenging it can be to give someone an experience. It's a lot of things that come together, and hopefully they come together well. And I think, with some of that knowledge of quadrupeds are hard, I think, for me as a gamer, like, once I started understanding more about how games are put together, I think it gave me a greater kind of, not only just like appreciation for a game I was really enjoying, but also it kind of helped me refocus on the things that matter in a game. Like, I'm playing Zelda right now, and every once in a while, like, a tree will pop into the background, but I don't care because like it's a beautiful game and the music and it's just such a fun, colorful world that like some of the small technical aspects of that, like they're just not that important to me. And it's like if I don't really think about them, I just have this wonderful, beautiful, pure experience. And I think, games are like wonderfully complex. And when you find moments of joy in them, I think you should celebrate them.
There's a lot of interesting stuff that I also wouldn't have realized before working in dev. Like you said, your characters have helmets on at the start of the game. It is so much more difficult to have people care about characters when you can't see their faces. So much more, like to an incredible degree that I'm very curious about Diablo 4 coming out this week, about how they approach their storytelling. When for the most part, outside of cutscenes, the characters are very small and you can't see their faces. It makes video game storytelling really hard. If you're, platforming, you're not looking at the person right next to you who's delivering information. You often just tune it out as noise. And that's a thing that, you wouldn't pay attention to unless you're the person who's trying to make sure people pay attention. A lot of really interesting challenges that you have to like fight against human psychology for sometimes, which is, I really didn't realize how much of empathy comes from looking at somebody's face. Even if they're a video game character. And it's such a huge thing, the way they look when they say something, the way they stand when they say something, and the fact that sometimes you have to be like, okay, you can run away if you want, I have no say in this, is very scary and very hard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, like, our narrative designers went to great lengths to make our characters come alive in the cantina as an example. And like on our side as writers, we're kind of talking through the dialogue, and the constraints on us is you have 3 or 4 back and forths before you think the player will probably wander away. And so you really have to grab someone early. And then, even if you can see their face in the cantina, are they gesturing appropriately? Will a gesture kind of turn? I've definitely played games where like the gestures of an NPC, like I can't focus on the dialogue because the gestures didn't match or were kind of different. And so again, it's like, and you only get so many gestures for characters in a game because
I think that happened to me. I voice a character in Cyberpunk, and the character animation versus what I say are so different that when I saw it, I was like, oh, then they don't match at all. And from what I thought it would be in my head, which makes it like, I can't watch it. I'm always like, oh, this is so weird.
It's really tough. Animation is definitely one of those under discussed, absolutely crucial elements
it's
for
also finite.
games
You can't
in
just
general.
animate everything.
It's finite and it's so valuable. And the right gesture versus the wrong gesture can sell a conversation as easily or as difficult as a voice actor.
Yeah. So for anyone who would like to have your job, which I'm sure is quite a few people, you got to be the lead writer on a Star Wars game. That's awesome. Not that I'm going to encourage people to steal your job specifically, but what do you have to say to people who like to get into games writing?
I after I got my job at Gearbox, I started thinking about like what I had done because I did a very quick pivot. Like I wanted to be a novelist in my 20s, and then some things happened, a tsunami, and I came back to the States and kind of had to evaluate my career. And what I did that I think was
like a literal tsunami.
Yeah, so I was in Japan in 2011 during the tsunami, and I had this like novelist dream job. I was going to teach English at a Japanese high school for like 15 hours a week and make really good money, and I was going to like use that to kind of write my first novel. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and then the tsunami hit, and we decided to leave. Spent all my life savings getting back to the States. Relationship ended, and like my game writer story was I like fished out like our Super Nintendo from our closet and played like Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past, Chrono Trigger, and Final Fantasy 4 and 6 over this like kind of sad few weeks of my life. And I was like, well, I always had this dream of being a novelist first, and then maybe getting into game writing as like an established fantasy novelist, like, takes his crack at it. And I just like pivoted immediately. And the things I did that I think there are even better tools to do nowadays is I like took it seriously, not across just game writing, but like I read like art composition books. I learned basic coding. I read a bunch of design books. And I think that really helped me like very quickly start to intuit some of the things that almost you can't learn until you become a developer. And so when I started writing game scripts and applying for jobs, I think my scripts had a bit more of that sense of the cost of a thing or like how you would implement a thing. And I think that helped me. Like I was applying for a Telltale job way back in the day and ended up going to Gearbox instead. But like I made my own Walking Dead script in Unity with a wonderful plugin. I mean, it was very bootleg.
Yeah,
it was like, but like, I photoshopped the Walking Dead characters and like did a little mini like playable choice-based script.
That's
I think,
so cool.
I think nowadays there's even like more amazing tools that to create a nicer product. So I think, anytime as a game writer, you can show people your dev knowledge, your dev skills, or you can kind of at least show that you're thinking about other disciplines and how they would work with you. I think that could be really useful.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a constant, and I'm sure I've said this on this exact show before. Sorry to anybody who's listened to multiple episodes. I think, so the way that I got my start was I was obviously games media for a really long time, but then I decided that I wanted to work in dev. So I just did game jams. I don't think many people actually fall into this job unless they're already in dev. A lot of it is like building a plan for exactly what you want to do. Having the realization is half the battle, but I was like, I know I want to do this. So I did as many game jams as I could to get an understanding of working with teams and how different creative disciplines work together and what your service actually is as a game writer and how you work with a programmer or a level designer or whatever, to also build up a portfolio, which I also submitted before I got my job, as well as like I wrote short stories and screenplays and mock game scripts for games I liked, which sounds like you did the same thing, just so that when I eventually felt like I was ready for the opportunity that I had stuff to submit. So really a lot of it, I think, is, figure out what you want to do and literally map out the steps to get there or the skills you think you would need and apply those. It seems to work out, allegedly.
Yeah, no, I think, the other thing is just, and like games are still part of the entertainment industry, which means they're still incredibly difficult to break in. And I think you have to try a lot of different paths. Like I did a bunch of indie games first, and then I got a fellowship, and then I got a AAA job from that. And it was a lot of years of rejection for sure. A lot of resumes sent, and no kind of response. And I think it's a bit of like any entertainment industry. It's a bit of persistence, but also a bit of luck. And I think it's like important to acknowledge that it's like, you increase your odds of potentially breaking in just the more you apply, the more people you meet. And, I think one thing just on top of that is game devs are pretty approachable. Like couldn't like email or send a LinkedIn to like some famous screenwriter whose movie you liked, but you can do that with games.
That's
like
true.
You can reach out to devs on social media, on LinkedIn and whatnot. And most of the time we will definitely respond.
I agree. I actually think most people would help you.
Yeah. And if you approach it with kind of a level of like respect for people's time, and you kind of ask questions that are like really geared towards like the person you're reaching out to, I think you can get a really good reaction. I respond to a lot of LinkedIn messages and Twitter and whatnot, just because I remember what it was like when I was starting out, and I was like, am I ever going to make my living as a game writer? Like how, like it's just an impossible thing. Like, and I had some devs that responded to me very early on that really kind of gave me, just kind of the sense of like, oh, I could be part of this someday.
Yeah, definitely. I, again, before I got my current job, I had asked friends who I knew who worked in the industry if I could sit in their writers' rooms, just to see what they do, which is all NDA. I'm not allowed to talk about any of it. But I did that for, I think, 3 separate game studios where I was just like, can I like just be bring your wannabe dev to work? And they all said yes. Every person I asked said yes, which is very cool. That's you're great. Right. The industry is really welcoming across the board.
Yeah.
So I won't take up any much.
To ask.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I think you have to be hungry, and don't be afraid to ask. Like the worst thing is someone tells you no, but the best thing is someone that goes, sure, come into our writer's room. And that's
here, do you want a job? Like it could go either direction. Definitely ask. Like you said, I think it's awesome that how you got involved in Respawn is in part just telling somebody you wanted to. It's such an important thing. So I won't take up any much more of your time. Where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, I'm on all the social medias. I started writing some articles on Substack about game writing.
Cool.
And I'm around,
Is there a place we can send people?
Yeah,
if you
Twitter
want.
and Substack I'm most active on.
It
I'm just
must be for
trying
your
to kind of.
username, Danny, for where they
Oh
can
yeah,
literally find you.
I think it's at Danny Homan. I think
Cool.
is or at Danny_Homan. Those are the ones.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Well, I'll leave a link in the description. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining me.
yeah, this is
Congratulations on
fun.
making a very fun game. That, yeah, like you said, just had a bunch of wonderful cast of characters that people do seem to have really fallen in love with. So you nailed it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Of course. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.